The new core weapons that are coming out as part of the mid-release of the Secrets of the Obscure expansion are currently available for beta testing, and I've tried all 9 classes, and as you can see, these are not final. That's what a beta test is. The skill icons are just a bunch of shovels, some of the animations need work, and the tuning can use some tweaks. But besides understanding that, I wanted to give my first impressions of all the new class core weapons. I did most of my testing in PvP matches because it's a more reliable way to get action, where my character has the most impact, and therefore the variables are minimized and I can get a real feel for whether the weapons actually work or don't. Obviously some of these weapons will be better or worse in other game modes, but at the end of the day, if you care, you can run whatever you want until you decide you want to play optimally, in which case you'll play the meta anyways, so don't expect your new weapons to always be the best. Keep this in mind when letting me know your thoughts in the comments, but here are the best and worst new core weapons. Let's start out with one of my favorites, the Thief Main Hand Axe. For the first time we get a new weapon that isn't two-handed, so that's nice that we get more combos from dual attacks from the offhand dagger and pistol. Basically when you combine axe with the pistol, you get a power playstyle, and when you combine it with the dagger, you get a Condi playstyle. When you use either your Axe 1, which cripples and bleeds, or your Axe 2, which is a shotgun that shoots 3 poison axes, those axes will remain there on the floor, and you can see how many axes are out by the buff on your buff bar. They do nothing while they're spinning there, but when you use the 3-skill dual attack, it will converge all of the axes on your target. The dagger offhand will port you to your target, and the pistol won't, and the axes will repeat their attack when they converge on your target, which is really good for the sneak attack on axe, which gives you extra initiative, so you get even more initiative back when you converge them to hit again. I was using an axe, pistol, sword, dagger, daredevil with the bound dodge and acrobatics, so I could dodge in my smoke fields for stealth and get out the sneak attack, then pop a few more axes out, and then converge the axes, then swap into sword dagger to follow up on the burst. The issue with the axe is that their hitboxes need to be bigger because they can miss enemies who are just walking casually away from you. Other than not being an amazingly powerful weapon, it was definitely a lot of fun and interesting. I wouldn't use this in World vs. World because it's so easily countered by movement, but also it isn't great in PvE because it's not very front-loaded burst damage, so maybe it will see play in PvP when they increase the hitbox range. The Guardian main hand and offhand pistol allows more conditioned playstyles because before Guardians relied mostly on their virtues and the torch to apply conditions, and maybe a little bit of axe, but that was it. So now there's a really good option for using the pistol on Guardian, and it works very well on Willbender because it has many multi-hitting attacks, like a beam and then an unload. Most of the skills are very straightforward in that you just do range damage, but the 3 skill is a symbol that turns allied projectiles that pass through it into burning projectiles, which can be nice in PvE, and the 5 skill allows you to charge up a ball of energy, which can knock enemies back and have a wider radius and deal more burning damage the larger you charge it up. My issue with this skill is that it takes so long to charge up, and once it's fully charged, you have to immediately shoot it, which doesn't work so well if you need precise timing to land it. So if there was a window of a second or two after it's fully charged where you can decide the timing of the orb, that would feel much better. This weapon will probably be played in all game modes. The Necromancer will be able to wield a main hand and an offhand sword, which is basically a ranged power playstyle with tons of self-healing, but also when you land some skills on the sword, you have the option to recast them for another effect at the cost of losing some life. So you basically sacrifice life and then regain it. There's chill on the 3rd chain of the 1st skill, and there's vulnerability and lifesteal everywhere else. I felt this would work well with the barrier of the Scourge or the high self-healing of the Harbinger to make up for sacrificing health, whereas Reaper can't really use its weapon skills while it's in Shroud. Some of the skills were projectiles and some weren't, and it felt fun to play because the animations just looked cool, though the numbers seemed a bit low, which can obviously be tuned higher. Mostly my issue though was that the animations were a bit hard to judge where they actually begin and end, so some of the hitboxes didn't match with where the animation looked like it was going. Also, the sword main hand allows you to get mobility on a Necromancer weapon with its double leap, and that will work nicely with a power harbinger that needs to have good positioning to survive because they're very squishy. I don't see this replacing staff on power builds in PvP just because it lacks the utility, but it could definitely work well in PvE or world versus world where you can get more value from constantly hitting targets to get the healing. Engineer gets the Shortbow, which has some cool ideas to it. It's sort of like the Necromancer staff, where you have the one skill which is just a decent attack, nothing special, but then it has 4 skills that all have the same range and mechanic. You basically shoot arrows with a payload and they land on your ground targeted spot from the air, not a projectile I believe. Then you can choose to explode them by recasting them, and if you explode one that is adjacent to another, it triggers the other to explode and gives them an additional effect. This was a pretty cool weapon in theory, but in practice the AoEs were too small to ever reactively hit anyone with them, and even if you did, their effect wasn't too prominent. They basically had utility effects like giving barrier, crippling enemies, stunning, or providing might, so not really doing damage or condition damage. It felt very underwhelming, but had great potential if they increased the radius of the effect by like double, and added pulsing power damage that actually zoned enemies, preventing them from going into that area or taking the damage. And that would make it pretty good in PvE where enemies would stand still in the pulsing damage, or in PvP where you can control objectives with it. But in world versus world, I don't think it would be that good because it would need to cover a lot more space. Warrior gets the staff, which is like a hybrid tank and support weapon. It has some decent crowd control with a pull, blocks, mobility, healing for allies, can give allies boons like Aegis and Unblockable, and even break stuns for its allies, which has never really been on a weapon skill before, except maybe the Firebrand Tome. Overall, it feels pretty good, and it should see play in all game modes to really add that missing piece to the warrior support build. But one issue is that if you're playing a support, you don't really have great access to adrenaline generation to use the burst skill that gives healing to allies, unless your other weapon is great at getting adrenaline. So while you might think warriors can go full support with like a sword warhorn and staff weapon set, neither of those weapons is your adrenaline provider. So you'd need discipline for sure, and then maybe cleansing ire for that, but then you need to be tactics to play support. I don't know, maybe add some more adrenaline generation to the tactics trait line, or you'll need to play a more hybrid support with like a hammer and not optimize as much for heals, but more for providing a little bit of heals while still being a frontline tank. So it definitely can see some play in world versus world Zergs, but I'm not so sure about in PvE or PvP. Mesmer gained the rifle, which is a support weapon, and that's been the theme for many classes. They add a support weapon if it wasn't previously available, because back when the game launched, they didn't plan for every class to be able to play support, but through the elite specializations, it's now possible. But there were big inconsistencies with the power level of each support by how many tools they had available to do so. Now Mesmer can do that better. There's a mini portal which you can have your allies take to come to you, but that requires a bit of coordination that in most unorganized situations might never be used. But luckily they made the portal skill optional, and if you choose not to open the portal, it has a lower cooldown, allowing you to just give the barrier and resistance that it also provides more often, which was good design. There were also some balance changes recently that made the more defensive Mesmer traits now share their effects to allies. So in general, Mesmer was already going to be in a good spot as a support without the rifle, but the rifle gives a bit more healing, can share Chaos Aura, and the rifle clones heal allies near the target they shoot at, which means it'll be a great support in PvE where you can summon a bunch of clones on the target and passively heal your team. But the skills are a bit slow to provide their effects when your allies need them. Also, the rifle phantasm summons a phantasm that stuns, but it takes so long to summon it and then have the phantasm shoot the bullet, which then has to travel to its target to stun it. By then, whatever you wanted to interrupt is over. It might be good for like setting up a burst where you precast the rifle stun and then weapon swap, but you can already do that with a stun that doesn't have such a long delay. Lowering some of these animation timers should help a lot. This might be good in PvE and World v World Zergs where support Mesmers are a thing already, but they lacked a good weapon to use. But I don't think it'll be great in PvP. Ranger got both the main hand and the offhand mace, which provides some powerful effects. Whenever you land a mace skill, it gives you stacks of a buff which does nothing at first, but whenever you get a certain amount of this buff, you become enlarged and gain tons of stat bonuses. Sort of like the new Norris relic they came out with. I don't think this effect is too meaningful, but because the mace skills are generally pretty good already, this weapon felt pretty good. It has a stun and blast finisher on the main hand and some regeneration application, so I think most support rangers will use a mace warhorn combo, but the offhand mace has some defensive capabilities to make it more like a slow bruiser playstyle. Ranger already has some of the most broken weapons in the game, so for mace to compete with things like hammer, greatsword, and sword would be difficult, but I think it would still be quite viable regardless in all game mode. I don't really have any issues with the maces, they felt the most polished weapon to me. Revenant gets a Scepter main hand, which is by far the most unique mechanic. You basically have a melee auto attack that has an extremely wide radius that just cleaves everything even remotely close to you, and the 3 skill is a tether that can be used on allies to give them boons, or on enemies to give them conditions. This is a 3 energy upkeep, which means when combined with your legend stance upkeep skills, you can deplete your energy very fast. But fortunately, there aren't many other skills that you need to use on the Scepter because it just wants you to auto attack. The more you use your auto attack while channeling the tether, the more conditions your enemy will get, or boons your ally will get. And the auto attack scales up to do a lot of damage over time. I was kind of confused though what kind of role they want this weapon to play, because the tether seems very 1v1 oriented or small scale, but then it also suggests a supportive playstyle, so maybe it's supposed to be played in small groups, kind of like a Spectre. I haven't done too much theory crafting with it yet, and it's just one weapon, so you can still have an offhand with it. Like an axe to chill and stick to your target while you auto attack them. Have another entirely different weapon to swap to, which by the way ends your tether when you swap, or you can swap legend stances to maintain your tether while using your energy up. I think it will mostly be a PvE weapon where you can get massive value hitting bosses with the max tether, because in PvP you can outrange the tether easily and break the synergy they built up. But then again, if it's used as a duelist, that means they win the node, so I could see it being a very viable tanky duelist in PvP. Finally, the Elementalist got a main hand pistol, and this was the worst designed weapon in my opinion. The skills have this mechanic where you use one of the attunement abilities, and that gives you a bullet ammo, sort of like a Virtuoso has blades. Then when you use another skill of that same element, it uses that bullet to empower that skill. So basically you want to decide whether you want to use the 2 then 3 skill, or the 3 then 2 skill, depending on what you want to empower. This can be complicated by the fact that Weaver dual attacks can give you a bullet, and also use bullets, but all of this complication didn't really matter to me because when using the pistol, I just didn't feel like I was doing combos because every skill was still mostly just a range attack that did some sort of condition. Although I was thinking, okay, let me use a 2 then 3 here because that does more damage, it still lacked that feeling of doing combos like the dagger, the sword, or even the hammer have. And if we want to compare the pistol to the scepter, because those weapons have a similar function, the scepter still feels much better because each attunement has distinct animations or skill ranges, whereas pistol is just the same thing in each attunement. Shoot your shot. Maybe I'm just not good at using the pistol because there were some skills that were different, and maybe it was just a little undertuned, but I think this weapon needs the most work to make it fun to play. I don't really see this one being used even in casual open world PvE because people play what's fun there, and I would rather just play any other weapon at that point. But those are just my opinions. I try to make my criticism constructive, but honestly, I don't pretend to be a game designer, and it's important to understand the perspectives of the devs when they're creating these new weapons. Many people who play one class and one build on that class get frustrated when their new weapon doesn't play the way they want it to, or give them the most powerful new option. But maybe another person does want that, or it provides something that wasn't available already to appeal to a new audience. And maybe that just means you need to learn to multi-class so you can have fun. Regardless, thank you for watching, subscribe and like the video if this was informative, and I will see you all next time.